When Ellie moved to the small town of Grey Hollow, she was eager for a fresh start. After weeks of apartment hunting, she finally found the perfect place, a charming old house divided into several units. The landlady, Mrs. Crenshaw, was kind but oddly insistent on one thing: stay away from the last room, on the left in the basement, she warned when handing over the keys. That room's locked for a reason. Ellie didn't think much of it at first. The basement was dark, damp, and musty, not a place she'd want to spend any time anyway, but her curiosity got the better of her. Why keep one room locked? What could be inside? Days passed without incident. Ellie settled into her new home, but the thought of the basement room gnawed at her. One night, as she was doing laundry downstairs, she caught herself staring at the door. It was an old wooden door with faded paint and rusting hinges, unremarkable in every way, except for the heavy iron padlock that kept it sealed. A creak broke the silence, and Ellie froze. It wasn't the sound of her movements, but something from the other side of the door. She told herself it was just the house settling, but the noise continued, a faint scraping, like something dragging along the floor. Her pulse quickened. Was someone inside? Against her better judgment, Ellie leaned closer, pressing her ear to the door. The scraping grew louder, more deliberate, and then, a soft whisper. She couldn't make out the words, but the voice sounded wrong, low, guttural, like it was struggling to speak. Panicked, Ellie rushed back upstairs, her mind racing. She considered telling Mrs. Crenshaw, but what would she say? I heard something behind the locked door you told me never to go near. She'd sound ridiculous. That night, she barely slept. Her dreams were plagued by the sound of scratching and whispers. When she awoke in the early hours, drenched in sweat, she swore she could hear faint noises from below. It wasn't just her imagination. The next day, Ellie resolved to forget about the basement. She stayed out of the house as much as possible, walking through town and trying to distract herself. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more the mystery of the locked room consumed her. On the fourth night, she made her decision. She needed to know. Armed with a flashlight and the courage she could muster, Ellie went down to the basement again. The scraping had stopped, but the air felt thick, like something was watching her. She examined the lock on the door. It was old and rusted. With enough force, she thought, it might break. After a few determined hits with a hammer, the padlock snapped open, and the door swung ajar with a low creak. The smell hit her first. It was damp, moldy, and something else, something metallic, like blood. Shining the flashlight into the room, she hesitated, heart pounding in her chest. Inside was a small, windowless space with stone walls. The floor was covered in deep scratches, as if something had been clawing to get out. In the center of the room was a tattered old bed, with restraints attached to the frame. Dusty, yellowed papers were scattered across the floor, covered in frantic handwriting and strange symbols Ellie couldn't understand. Then she saw it. In the far corner, something moved, something hunched and unnatural. It looked vaguely human but was twisted, misshapen, and impossibly thin. Its skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes, wide and hollow, locked onto her. The moment she stepped into the room, Ellie froze, the beam of her flashlight trembling in her hand. The creature let out a low, guttural sound, the same voice she had heard whispering through the door, and began to crawl toward her, dragging its broken limbs across the floor. She stumbled backward, her scream caught in her throat, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Desperately, she fumbled for the handle, pulling with all her strength, but the door wouldn't budge. Behind her, the creature's risping breath grew louder, closer. In a panic, Ellie turned to face it, her flashlight flickering. The thing was just inches away, its face twisted into a grotesque smile. Its fingers, long and bony, reached out toward her. With a surge of adrenaline, Ellie slammed her shoulder against the door one final time, and it flew open. She didn't look back. She sprinted upstairs and out of the house, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The moment she reached the street, she collapsed, trembling, as the door to the basement slammed shut behind her on its own. Ellie didn't return to the house. The next morning, she packed her belongings and left without a word. Mrs. Crenshaw didn't ask why. As she drove out of Grey Hollow, she glanced in her rearview mirror. For a moment, she thought she saw something hunched and twisted in the back seat, grinning at her with hollow eyes.